At 7:58 a.m., Arthur Sterling, the third-generation patriarch of Sterling Industries, held a pen carved from the polished oak of his grandfather's first factory floor. It was a relic, a symbol of a legacy he was about to sign into oblivion. The document before him, a Chapter 11 filing prepared by the Sharks at Cravath, Swain and Moore, was the company's death certificate. His entire world, a sprawling empire of American steel, manufacturing, and logistics built over a century, was balanced on the nib of that pen. Julian Croft, his trusted COO and the son he never had, stood behind him, a hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture of feigned commiseration. The lawyers, their faces impassive marble masks, watched him. They were all waiting for the final, merciful execution. But Arthur wasn't looking at the signature line. His gaze was fixed on the young woman standing near the door, clutching a stained diner apron in her hands, as if it were a shield. The waitress. The girl who, not 3 hours earlier, had served him a lukewarm cup of coffee and, with a trembling finger, pointed to a single appendix in the 600-page document. An appendix that wasn't a mistake. It was a multi-billion-dollar mirage. The clock on the wall of the Starlight Diner had been stuck at 4:13 for the better part of a decade. It was an appropriate time for a place that existed outside of time, a haven for the sleepless, the haunted, and the terminally weary of Chicago. For Elara Vance, known to her regulars as Ellie, she was firmly in the weary category. Her shift was a 16-hour marathon, fueled by caffeine and the dull ache in her feet. She wiped down the cracked red vinyl of a booth, the scent of industrial cleaner mingling with the ghosts of burnt bacon and stale coffee. Each swipe of her rag was a meditation on failure. 4 years ago, Elara Vance wasn't slinging hash. She was a senior analyst at Geoanalytics, a boutique firm that consulted for global logistics companies and government agencies. Her specialty was GIS, Geographic Information Systems. She didn't just read maps, she saw them in 4 dimensions. She could look at a set of coordinates and see the story, the floodplain encroachments, the soil liquefaction risks, the subtle shifts in topography that could turn a billion-dollar infrastructure project into a sinkhole. She saw the patterns others missed, the truths hidden in the landscape. Then she'd missed one, a big one, a decimal point misplaced in a seismic risk assessment for a new bridge in Southeast Asia. A bridge that had later failed during a moderate earthquake. No one was killed, but the financial and professional fallout had been catastrophic. The firm settled, her boss took the public fall, but Elara's confidence, the very bedrock of her talent, had shattered. She'd retreated, trading the high-stakes world of cartographic certainty for the unambiguous reality of a coffee pot and a grill. Here, a mistake meant a burnt piece of toast, not a collapsed bridge. The tips she earned barely covered the rent on her tiny studio apartment, a self-imposed penance for a failure she couldn't outrun. The jingle of the bell over the door was sharp, angry. A man stumbled in, propelled not by the wind, but by the crushing gravity of his own despair. He wasn't a cop or a trucker. He was old money, even in his state of utter dishevelment. His overcoat, a Brioni, was wrinkled and thrown over a suit that probably cost more than Ellie's car. But it was his face that arrested her. It was pale, etched with the fine lines of sleepless nights and profound stress. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, were hollowed out, defeated. He looked like a Roman emperor surveying the ashes of his city. This was Arthur Sterling. Ellie knew the name, of course. Sterling Industries was a Chicago institution, as much a part of the city's skyline as the Willis Tower. To her, he was just another ghost for Booth 4. He sank into the vinyl, the springs groaning under his weight. A thick, leather-bound binder, embossed with the Sterling Industries crest, slammed onto the table. It landed with the finality of a coffin lid. "Whiskey," he rasped, his voice gravelly. "And coffee." "Don't have whiskey, sir," Ellie said, her voice a practiced, neutral monotone. "Got coffee?" "Fine, just the coffee. Black." She returned with a thick, chipped ceramic mug. He didn't look up. He had already opened the binder, his hands, adorned with a heavy gold signet ring, shaking with a tremor that was more than just fatigue. It was the vibration of a structure about to collapse. Ellie busied herself behind the counter, her ingrained habit of observation taking over. The man in booth 4 was a case study in ruin. He wasn't reading the pages, he was staring through them, as if trying to see a past where they didn't exist. His phone, a sleek, modern device that looked alien on the worn formica, buzzed violently. The screen lit up. Julian Croft. After the 5th buzz, Arthur snatched it. "What, Julian? What more is there to say? To make sure I'm at the office by 8 to sign my own death warrant. Don't worry, I'll be there." His voice was low, a controlled burn of fury. Ellie could feel the heat of it from across the room. "No, I haven't signed yet. I'm reviewing." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped his lips. "Reviewing the nail in my father's coffin. Yes, I know Cravath is waiting. I know the creditors are circling. You don't have to remind me that this is the end. I was there when it began." A long, heavy silence. Arthur's face seemed to age another decade. "Just let me have a minute, Julian. I'll be there. I'll sign the damn papers." He ended the call and tossed the phone aside. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders, broad and powerful even in defeat, trembling with a silent sob. Ellie felt an unexpected pang of empathy. Sterling Industries. A titan. And this was its king, moments from his own abdication. He looked up, his red-rimmed eyes catching hers. "What are you staring at?" he snapped, the grief curdling into anger. "Nothing, sir," Ellie said, her voice soft. "Looks like a long night." "You're looking at the end of 112 years, he muttered, more to himself than to her. He gestured vaguely at the binder. All gone. Because of one deal. One catastrophic acquisition that went south. He tapped a thick section of the binder. Terra Nova Logistics. A portfolio of prime industrial real estate, supposedly. The collateral for a syndicated loan that was supposed to fund our expansion. Except the market turned. The loan was called. The collateral. It's worthless. And it's dragged the whole company down with it. He signaled for more coffee. It was 5:15 a.m. The sky outside was beginning to bruise with the first light of a cold, grey Chicago dawn. The 8 a.m. deadline loomed like a headsman's axe. As Ellie leaned over to pour, her exhausted body betrayed her. Her elbow, slick with condensation from the counter, bumped the heavy mug. It was a small, clumsy movement. But in the supercharged atmosphere of the booth, it was a detonation. Hot black coffee surged across the table, a dark tide moving with terrifying speed directly toward the open binder, toward the pristine, execution-ready bankruptcy documents. "No, you clumsy fool," Arthur roared, jumping to his feet. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry," Ellie gasped, grabbing a fistful of napkins. She lunged, trying to sop up the liquid before it could ruin the pages. Her hands moved with an instinct she didn't know she possessed, shielding the most critical section. She began dabbing, her heart pounding, expecting to be fired, screamed at, or worse. "Get away from it," he yelled. "You've probably destroyed it. We'll need new copies printed. It will delay everything." "I'm just trying to dry it, sir," she insisted, her hands moving with frantic precision. And that's when she saw it. Her eyes, trained for years to find anomalies in geographical data, to spot the one coordinate that didn't belong, locked onto the page she was blotting. It wasn't a legal clause or a financial figure. It was Appendix C, Schedule of Collateralized Assets, Terra Nova Logistics. It was a long, dry list of property addresses, parcel numbers, and most importantly, GPS coordinates. And one of them, a high-value warehouse property listed in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, made her blood run cold. Her hand stopped moving. The coffee-soaked napkin hovered an inch from the paper. "What is it now?" Arthur spat, misinterpreting her pause as incompetence. "Did the ink run?" Ellie didn't hear him. She was no longer in the Starlight Diner. She was back at her desk at Geoanalytics 4 years ago, staring at a satellite map of the Louisiana coastline, running a simulation for a client on storm surge impact. She was looking at the very same coordinates. She looked up from the page, her eyes wide with a terrifying electric certainty, and met Arthur Sterling's furious gaze. "Sir," she whispered, her voice shaking not with fear, but with dawning revelation. "This property, it doesn't exist. It's in the middle of a ghost swamp." Arthur Sterling stared at the waitress, his mind already frayed by the impending doom, unable to compute the absurdity of her statement. "What?" he snarled, pulling the document away from her. The page was stained, but the text was legible thanks to her quick work. "What did you say?" "This asset," Ellie repeated, her voice gaining a strange, forgotten authority. She pointed a trembling finger at the specific line item. TNLWH 1138, Plaquemines Parish. Claimed value, $85 million. The coordinates listed here. I know them. 4 years ago, I ran a coastal erosion projection for a shipping consortium. These coordinates aren't just near the water, sir. They're in the water. It's a phantom coastline, a patch of land that hasn't been viable for construction since Hurricane Katrina. It's a salt marsh. A thick, charged silence descended on the diner. Arthur let out a short, barking laugh, devoid of all humor. "It doesn't exist. Lady, it's the most real thing in my life. It's part of a $2 billion portfolio of assets that my COO, Julian Croft, personally vetted. It's the anchor that's dragging my entire company to the bottom of the ocean." The name Julian Croft landed like a second blow. Ellie's mind, dormant for so long, began to whir, the gears grinding back to life. She looked at the list again, a new, horrifying clarity taking shape. Arthur's anger began to curdle into a wary curiosity. He took a step back, truly seeing her for the first time, the cheap uniform, the exhaustion, the raw intelligence that now burned in her eyes. "Who are you?" "My name is Elara Vance," she said, the fog of the diner replaced by the white-hot adrenaline of the chase. "I used to be a GIS analyst. I specialized in site viability and risk assessment. I looked at places like this for a living." She tapped the page again. "This isn't just one mistake, sir. A single clerical error is possible. But look." Her finger traced down the list. "Here's another one. A distribution center in Ohio. The address is correct, but the parcel number corresponds to a protected national park. And this one in Nevada, the coordinates are for a dry lake bed." Arthur sank back into the booth, the strength gone from his legs. "That's impossible. My team. Julian, they conducted months of due diligence. We have surveyor reports, environmental impact statements, title deeds. You have paper," Ellie countered, her voice sharp. "Brilliant, convincing paper. But the land, the actual, physical ground, it tells a different story. This isn't a portfolio of distressed assets, Mr. Sterling. It's a portfolio of lies. The $2 billion loan that's bankrupting you wasn't secured by real estate. It was secured by a fantasy. Arthur was breathing heavily, his face ashen. He was a man who built things from iron and steel, from concrete and sweat. The idea that his empire was being felled by something that wasn't even real was a concept his mind struggled to grasp. "Julian," he whispered. "No, not Julian. I took him in after his father died. I mentored him. He's been my right hand for 15 years. He brought this deal to me. He was so passionate about it. He said it was the future, a way to leverage logistics to modernize the company." "He's a very good actor," Ellie said grimly. "Think about it. He finds this incredible portfolio. He manages the due diligence. He champions the deal. When the market turns and the loan is called, he's the one who regretfully informs you the collateral is worthless and that bankruptcy is the only option. He's not your advisor, Mr. Sterling. He's the architect of your destruction." "But why?" Arthur's voice was a raw wound. "He has millions in stock options. If Sterling goes down, he loses everything." "Does he?" Ellie challenged, her analyst's brain firing on all cylinders. "Or is there a predator waiting in the wings? A private equity firm that Julian has been quietly negotiating with? Someone who plans to buy Sterling Industries out of bankruptcy for pennies on the dollar, shed the legacy manufacturing divisions, and keep the valuable patents and intellectual property?" Arthur's mind flashed to the relentless, aggressive bidder that had been circling for weeks, the one Julian had been pushing him to accept a pre-packaged deal with. "Phoenix Equity Group," he whispered. "And I'd be willing to bet," Ellie said, leaning in, "that Phoenix Equity Group has already offered Julian Croft the CEO position of the new, restructured company, plus a signing bonus that looks suspiciously like a percentage of the $2 billion that will simply vanish when the phantom assets are written off in the bankruptcy proceedings." The entire, horrifyingly elegant crime laid itself bare in Arthur's mind. Julian creates a portfolio of phantom assets. He uses it to secure a massive loan from a syndicate of banks, likely feeding them the same fraudulent data. The loan money is funneled into the company and then out again through opaque project budgets Julian controls. When the time is right, the loan defaults, triggering the bankruptcy. Julian, the loyal COO, manages the sale of the company to his secret partners, Phoenix Equity. The banks are left holding worthless swampland, the company is dismembered, and Julian walks away with a golden parachute, the CEO title, and his share of the stolen billions. He wasn't just sinking the ship, he was setting it on fire to collect the insurance money before selling the scrap. Arthur Sterling looked at the clock on the wall, the one that was forever 4:13. His watch read 5:52 a.m. "The meeting is at 8 a.m., he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "In my boardroom. Julian will be there, the lawyers, the creditors committee, the vultures from Phoenix Equity." "They're all in the same room," Ellie said. "How efficient for them." "If I walk in there and accuse him, he'll deny everything," Arthur said, thinking aloud. "It's my word and the word of a waitress against his mountain of forged paperwork. He's covered his tracks." "He covered his paper trail," Ellie corrected. "But he couldn't cover the earth itself. He's arrogant. He thinks he's already won. He got lazy. The proof isn't in your files, Mr. Sterling. It's on the ground. But we don't have time to send a survey team to Louisiana." "Then how do we prove it?" Arthur asked. He was no longer talking to a waitress. He was consulting with his last, and only, expert. "How do we prove a hole in the world in 2 hours?" Ellie's mind raced. The diner, her exhaustion, it all melted away. She was back. "I can't prove it from here," she said. "But we can create enough reasonable doubt to stop that signing. You have your phone. You have access. You need to call someone, not Julian, not your lawyers. They're either compromised or they've been duped. Is there anyone at all who is loyal only to you? Someone from the old guard?" Arthur nodded slowly. Margaret Vinson. She was my father's executive assistant. She's been with the company for 50 years. She's the company's memory. She works from home now as the corporate archivist. "Call her. Wake her up. Tell her it's a code 1, Ellie commanded, grabbing a clean napkin and Arthur's oak pen. "We need 2 things. First, we need the raw satellite imagery data for those coordinates. Not the clean, processed images from the surveyor reports Julian commissioned. We need the unfiltered data from the USGS archives or a commercial provider like Maxar. Margaret will know how to access those databases. Tell her to look for imagery from the last 6 months for these specific coordinates." Ellie scribbled down the 3 locations she'd spotted. "What are we looking for?" Arthur asked, his fingers already dialing. "We're looking for the truth," Ellie said. "We're looking for a swamp, a forest, and a dry lake. We're looking for a picture that proves Julian's paperwork is a lie." Arthur barked orders into the phone. "Margaret, wake up! It's Arthur. I have a code 1. No questions. Just listen." Ellie continued, her voice urgent. "Second, while she's pulling the imagery, she needs to search the company's digital archives, specifically Julian Croft's project files from his first 5 years at the company. 15, 20 years ago." "What for?" "A playbook," Ellie said. "A fraud this complex isn't invented overnight. He's done something like this before, on a smaller scale. He has a method. He would have developed it early in his career. Look for proposals, logistical analysis, anything related to land acquisition or asset leveraging. We're looking for a project where he first tested this theory of creating value out of worthless land." Arthur relayed the instructions. The diner was beginning to fill with the early morning crowd, construction workers and office cleaners, oblivious to the corporate war being waged in Booth 4. "Now what?" Arthur asked, after he hung up. "Now," Ellie said, refilling his coffee mug, her hand as steady as a surgeon's. "We wait, and you might want to order some breakfast. You're going to need your strength." The 67 minutes that followed were the most agonizing of Arthur Sterling's life. The Starlight Diner, once a refuge, had become a cage. Every clatter of cutlery, every ring of the bell over the door was a hammer blow to his nerves. He sat staring at his phone, which lay dark and silent on the table. Beside him, Ellie was an island of unnerving calm. She sketched furiously on a napkin, not doodles, but what looked like topographical lines and elevation markers. She was in her element. At 7:01 a.m., the phone finally buzzed. Arthur snatched it up, activating the speaker. Margaret Vinson's voice, thin and reedy but sharp as a needle, crackled through the phone. "Arthur, I have it. I had to use my old credentials to get into the raw USGS satellite feeds, but I'm in. The waitress, she was right." Ellie leaned closer, her eyes fixed on the phone. "The Louisiana coordinates," Margaret said, the sound of keyboard clicks in the background. "It's exactly what she said. It's a salt marsh. The latest imagery from 3 weeks ago shows it's partially submerged. There's no building, Arthur. There's no access road. There's nothing." A strangled sound, half sob, half laugh, escaped Arthur's throat. "The Ohio property is deep inside the Cuyahoga Valley National Park," Margaret continued, her voice gaining speed. "And the Nevada site. It's the Black Rock Desert. There's nothing there but cracked earth and dust devils. The surveyor photos in Julian's report, they're fakes. Good ones, but fakes. The metadata shows they were created with rendering software, not a camera." "We have it," Arthur whispered, looking at Ellie with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He faked it all. "That's not all, Arthur," Margaret said, her voice dropping. "I found the playbook. 20 years ago, when Julian was just a junior analyst, your father assigned him to a logistics project for a new plant in Gary, Indiana. He wrote a proposal, a theoretical exercise, he called it. A strategy for maximizing underutilized land parcels as leveraged collateral. It's all here, Arthur, the whole scheme, laid out step by step, using digital rendering to create hypothetical infrastructure, creating shell surveyor firms to validate the data, forming offshore holding companies to obscure ownership. He named the theoretical holding company in his proposal Terra Nova. He's been sitting on this plan for 2 decades. The final piece clicked into place. This wasn't an act of desperate greed. It was the culmination of Julian's life's work, a grand, sociopathic masterpiece of betrayal. "Margaret," Arthur said, his voice now cold, hard steel, "email the satellite images and that proposal to my personal account. Now." "Doing it." "Then call security at the Sterling Tower, not the front desk guards. Call Frank Miller, head of my personal detail. Tell him I want his team on the 50th floor, outside the main boardroom. Plain clothes. They are not to let anyone, and I mean anyone, leave that room until I give the order. Understood, Arthur? One more thing, Margaret. Get me the direct line for Assistant U.S. Attorney Peterson in the White-Collar Crime Division. Tell his office that Arthur Sterling has definitive proof of a multi-billion-dollar wire and securities fraud, and the man responsible will be gift-wrapped for them in less than an hour." He hung up the phone. The clock on his watch read 7:19 a.m. He looked at Ellie. This young woman in a stained uniform, a ghost from a forgotten career, had just handed him back his life. I should finish my shift," Ellie stammered, the adrenaline beginning to recede, the harsh reality of her own life flooding back in. "My manager will be here soon." Arthur let out a real laugh, the first in months. It was a rusty, powerful sound. He reached into his wallet, pulled out his black Amex and flagged down the other waitress. "Miss," he said, "I need to buy your colleague's contract and her apron." He turned to Ellie. "You're not finishing your shift. You're not a waitress anymore. As of this moment, you are a special consultant to the CEO of Sterling Industries." He threw a wad of $100 bills on the table, enough to cover the coffee and buy the diner for the day. The coffee was terrible, by the way. Ellie stood frozen, her world tilting on its axis. "Get your coat, Miss Vance," Arthur said, shrugging on his own brioni. The broken man was gone. In his place stood the titan his grandfather had raised. "We have a meeting to attend." The elevator ride to the 50th floor of the Sterling Tower was a silent, stomach-churning ascent. Ellie stared at her reflection in the polished brass walls. She was still wearing her diner uniform, black slacks, non-slip shoes, and a faded white polo shirt with Starlight Diner embroidered on the chest. The faint smell of coffee and grease clung to her. Next to her, Arthur Sterling looked like a king girding for battle. The despair was gone, replaced by a righteous, glacial fury. "Mr. Sterling, Arthur, I can't go in there," she said, her voice a nervous whisper. "I'm a waitress. They'll eat me alive." Arthur turned to her, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "First, you are not a waitress. You're the analyst who saw what an army of lawyers and accountants missed. Second, they won't be looking at your clothes. They'll be looking at the truth. And Julian, he needs to see you. He needs to see the ghost who came back to haunt him." The elevator doors opened onto a hushed, opulent world of marble floors and dark wood. At the end of the hall, Before the towering mahogany doors of the boardroom, two of Arthur's security men stood, stone-faced. They gave him a subtle nod. Arthur pushed the doors open and strode in. The room fell silent. It was a cathedral of corporate power, dominated by a massive granite table. At the far end, framed by a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, sat Julian Croft. He looked sleek, confident, and concerned, a masterful performance. He was flanked by the team from Cravath. Along the sides of the table sat the creditors' committee and two smug-looking men from Phoenix Equity. Every head turned. A wave of irritation rippled through the room at Arthur's lateness. Then they saw Ellie, and the irritation turned to baffled contempt. Julian's mask of sympathy slipped for a fraction of a second, replaced by a smirk. "Arthur, you're late. And you've brought catering?" One of the Phoenix men chuckled. "Something like that, Julian," Arthur said, his voice resonating in the quiet room. He walked to his chair at the head of the table, but remained standing. He gestured for Ellie to stand beside him. She felt like a Daniel in the lion's den. "Gentlemen, this is Miss Elara Vance," Arthur announced. "She's a specialist in topographical analysis. She'll be advising me this morning." Julian waved a dismissive hand. "Arthur, for God's sake, we don't have time for whatever this is. The filing has to be executed by 9 a.m. We need your signature." He slid the heavy binder down the polished granite. Arthur looked at the binder, then at Julian. "It's a sad day, Julian. 112 years, up in smoke. All because of that Terra Nova portfolio. Such a tragedy." "It is," Julian said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "A catastrophic miscalculation of the market. I feel the weight of it every day, Arthur. I truly do." "Oh, I'm sure you do," Arthur said. "You were so thorough in your due diligence, so meticulous. That's why I was surprised when Ms. Vance, in a preliminary review this morning, noticed a few geographical inconsistencies." Julian's smile tightened. A muscle in his jaw began to twitch. "Inconsistencies? What is she talking about? The data was vetted B.E. The air in the boardroom was the sterile, refrigerated air of places where fortunes were made and lost with the stroke of a pen. It was a soundless, pressurized environment, and for a moment Ellie felt as if she were at the bottom of the ocean. Julian's condescending question, "Catering?" Hung in the stillness, a small, ugly dart aimed at her heart. She felt the familiar, cold flush of shame, the instinct to shrink, to apologize for her very existence. It was the same feeling she'd lived with for 4 years, the ghost of a collapsed bridge clinging to her like a shroud. But then she looked at Arthur. He wasn't looking at Julian. He was looking at her, and in his eyes she saw not pity, but a terrifying, absolute trust. He was betting the soul of his 100-year-old company on her. The weight of that trust was heavier than any failure. It was an anchor. Arthur's voice, when he spoke, was not the roar of a titan, but the low, resonant hum of a blast furnace, immense power held in careful reserve. "Something like that, Julian," he said, his gaze finally shifting to the man he had once called son. He didn't move to his chair. He stood at the head of the table like a prosecuting attorney, his presence a stark, vertical line of judgment in a room of seated men. He gestured for Ellie to stand beside him, a small, deliberate movement that conferred upon her a status no one in the room could comprehend. "Gentlemen, this is Miss Elara Vance," Arthur announced. His tone was matter-of-fact, as if introducing a world-renowned expert, which, in that moment, she was. "She's a specialist in topographical analysis and foundational asset integrity. She'll be advising me this morning." The title was an invention, a shield he had crafted for her on the elevator ride up, but it landed with surprising weight. The men from Phoenix Equity exchanged a look of wary confusion. The lawyers from Cravath, sensing a deviation from the script, began shuffling their papers with nervous energy. Julian, however, maintained his composure, a mask of pained patience. "Arthur, with all due respect, we don't have time for this theatre. The filing has to be executed by 9 a.m. The creditors' committee has a flight to catch." He slid the heavy, leather-bound binder down the polished granite, a serpent offering an apple. "We need your signature." Arthur looked at the binder, a document that represented the sum of all his fears, and then his gaze settled on Julian, a long, searching look that held 15 years of shared history. "It's a sad day, Julian," he said, his voice laced with a genuine, cutting sorrow. 112 years of my family's sweat and blood, reduced to this piece of paper, all because of that Terra Nova portfolio. Such a tragedy." "It is," Julian said, his voice a masterpiece of feigned sincerity. "A catastrophic miscalculation of the market. I feel the weight of it every day, Arthur. I promise you, no one feels this failure more keenly than I do." "Oh, I believe you feel a weight, Julian," Arthur said softly. "You were so thorough in your due diligence, so meticulous. That's why I was so surprised when Miss Vance, in a preliminary review this morning, noticed a few geographical inconsistencies. Anomalies in the foundation, you might say." The word foundation hung in the air. Julian's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. A single muscle in his jaw began a frantic, tiny dance. "Inconsistencies? What is she talking about? The data was vetted by the best surveyors in the business. We have certifications, geological reports, everything." "You have paper," Arthur countered, his voice hardening. "Beautiful, expensive, convincing paper. But paper, as it turns out, can burn. The earth, however, endures." He nodded to Ellie. This was it. The room seemed to tilt, every eye locking on to her. The diner uniform felt impossibly thin, a pathetic armor against the combined force of their skepticism and contempt. But Arthur's words, "The earth endures," echoed in her mind. That was her territory. She wasn't here to talk about finance or law. She was here to talk about the ground beneath their feet. She took a breath, and the voice that emerged was not the timid murmur of a waitress, but the clear, precise tone of an analyst presenting irrefutable fact. "Mr. Croft," she began, her eyes meeting his across the vast expanse of the table. "Let's start with asset TNLWH, Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana. Your report, which I reviewed, values the land and the state-of-the-art warehouse facility upon it at $85 million. She paused, letting the number settle. But according to the latest multispectral satellite imagery from the USGS Landlook archive, pulled at 6:58 this morning, the property at those specific coordinates is not only undeveloped, it is currently submerged beneath approximately 1.4 meters of brackish water. It's not a construction site, it's a salt marsh." She slid her phone, an old model with a cracked screen, onto the table and swiped. She had prepared the exhibits in the car on the way over. A high-resolution satellite image appeared, stark and undeniable. A red pin, precise as a drop of blood, marked the coordinates in a swirl of muddy green and brown. She pushed it toward the center of the table. A low murmur rippled through the room. The lawyers leaned forward, their professional curiosity overriding their allegiance. Julian stared at the image, his face losing a shade of its healthy tan. This is absurd," he sputtered, trying to rally. "Satellite data can be misinterpreted. Atmospheric distortion, outdated imagery. We have ground surveys, photographs. The photographs in your due diligence file are quite impressive, Ellie continued, her voice gaining a cold, intellectual strength. She felt a strange sense of detachment, the same focus she used to have when dissecting a complex data set. The fear was gone, replaced by the pure, clean adrenaline of the truth. However, the metadata embedded in the image files shows they weren't created by a camera. They were rendered using V-Ray and Autodesk Revit software. They are architectural visualizations, Mr. Croft, not photographs. They are very beautiful lies. The air in the room grew thick, heavy, and toxic. Lawrence Shaw, the senior partner from Phoenix Equity, had stopped smiling. His face was a mask of dawning horror as he realized he was sitting in a room with a ticking bomb. We also have the property in Cuyahoga Valley, Ohio. Ellie pressed on, relentless. Your report shows a 500,000 square foot distribution center. The National Park Service, however, lists that exact parcel as a protected peregrine falcon nesting site, and has since 1983. Another swipe. A picture of a lush, dense forest appeared on her phone's screen. Julian's composure was beginning to fray, the elegant fabric of his deception tearing at the seams. This is a character assassination, a setup. Arthur, you can't possibly be listening to this. This nobody you found in a greasy spoon. Arthur remained silent, his face carved from granite. He was letting Ellie dismantle him, piece by piece. It was her discovery. It had to be her kill. And finally, Ellie said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing them all in for the final, fatal blow. There's your theoretical proposal from 20 years ago, the one you wrote as a junior analyst for Arthur's father, Charles Sterling. I believe the title was A Strategy for Maximizing Underutilized Land Parcels as Leveraged Collateral. She looked directly at Julian now, and for the first time, she saw raw, naked fear in his eyes. It was a brilliant paper, really, she said, a trace of professional admiration in her tone. It outlined this exact methodology, using digital rendering to create hypothetical infrastructure on worthless land, creating shell surveyor firms with convincing credentials to validate the fraudulent data, forming offshore holding companies to obscure ownership and launder the proceeds of the secured loans. You even named the theoretical holding company in your proposal Terra Nova. You've been rehearsing this for 2 decades. Julian Croft went white, not pale, the color of bone ash. He looked from Ellie's calm, accusing face to Arthur's stony expression, and in that moment, he understood. The trap had not just been discovered, it had been sprung. He was caught. "This is a lie, a conspiracy," he shrieked, his carefully constructed persona shattering into 1,000 pieces. He shot to his feet, his eyes wild and desperate, scanning the room for an ally, an escape route, finding only stunned, accusatory faces. "She's a nobody, a washed-up analyst who got fired for incompetence, for collapsing a bridge. She's trying to save her own pathetic career by destroying mine. Security! The mention of the bridge was a desperate, cruel gambit. And for a heartbeat, it found its mark. The air left Ellie's lungs. The boardroom walls seemed to close in. But then she looked at the satellite photo still glowing on her phone. The image of the swamp. The truth. Her failure had taught her a lesson Julian had never learned. You can lie on paper, but you cannot lie to the earth. That failure was the very reason she was standing here today. It had honed her, made her vigilant, made her incapable of ever again taking a foundation for granted. "Security is waiting for you, Julian," Arthur said, his voice as final as a judge's gavel. As if on cue, the grand mahogany doors swung open. It wasn't the building's uniformed guards. It was two men and a woman in dark, sober suits that screamed federal law enforcement. They were flanked by Frank Miller and his team, who moved with an unnerving, quiet efficiency to seal the room. "Julian Croft," the lead agent said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "You're under arrest for wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud." Chaos erupted. It was not the loud cinematic explosion Julian might have imagined, but a sickening implosion. He didn't lunge or roar. He simply collapsed back into his chair, a puppet with its strings cut. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a terrifying, hollow understanding of his new reality. His empire, built on a swamp of lies, had just been reclaimed by the tide. As the agents approached, cuffing his hands behind his back, his head lifted, and his eyes, filled with a venomous, curdled hatred, found Ellie. "You," he whispered, the single word carrying the weight of his entire ruined ambition. "You're nothing. A ghost. A map reader in a coffee-stained shirt." Ellie met his gaze, unflinching. The fear was gone. The shame was gone. All that remained was a profound, weary clarity. She reached into the pocket of her slacks, her fingers closing around the familiar, rough fabric of the stained Starlight diner apron she had stuffed there hours ago. She pulled it out and let it hang from her fingers. "You're right," she said, her voice clear and carrying across the suddenly silent room. "I am a map reader. And the map I drew this morning doesn't lead to an empire. It leads directly to a federal correctional institution. I'd advise you to get used to the topography." The boardroom was no longer a place of business. It was a crime scene. As they hauled Julian away, a shrunken, defeated figure, a palpable shockwave of self-preservation, washed over the room. The Cravath lawyers were pale, frantically whispering into their phones, calculating their firm's liability. The Phoenix equity partners looked like men who had just watched their lifeboat sink, realizing how close they had come to being named as co-conspirators. The bankruptcy signing was, needless to say, indefinitely postponed. Arthur Sterling walked to the head of the table. He picked up the 600-page binder, the death certificate of his company, held it for a moment, and then let it drop into a nearby wastebasket with a soft, satisfying thud. He looked at the stunned, ashen faces remaining around his table. "Sterling Industries is not for sale," he announced, his voice booming with a power they had not heard in years. "It is not bankrupt. It was, however, the victim of a significant and sophisticated internal fraud." He paused, letting the weight of his next words land. "As of 9:05 a.m., Ms. Vance is heading a new, independent internal asset verification unit. Her mandate is absolute. Her authority reports directly, and only, to me. Her first order of business will be a full, forensic audit of every single partner, contractor, and financial instrument associated with the Terra Nova deal, starting with everyone in this room." He let the threat hang in the air, a guillotine poised. He then turned and walked toward the door, not looking back. "Ellie, my office. We have a company to rebuild from the foundation up." Ellie took one last look at the room full of shattered power brokers. She walked to Julian Croft's empty chair and let the dirty apron fall from her hand onto the expensive leather. A small, stained flag planted on conquered ground. Then she turned and followed Arthur, walking away from the wreckage and toward a horizon she couldn't yet see. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. They were a war fought in silence, in spreadsheets and sub-basements. Averting the bankruptcy was like defusing a bomb. The immediate threat was gone, but the room was still littered with live explosives. The news of Julian's spectacular fraud sent shockwaves through the financial world. Creditors, while relieved, were now deeply suspicious. Trust, Arthur knew, was like the structural integrity of a bridge. It was absolute until it wasn't, and once compromised, the entire structure was suspect. He didn't give Ellie a corner office on the 50th floor. He gave her something far more valuable: the keys to a forgotten, windowless records room in the building's 3rd sub-level, a place rumored to be haunted by the ghost of a long-dead filing clerk. He gave her a team of 3 young, hungry and deeply skeptical auditors who had been sidelined by Julian's regime. And he gave her a single, terrifying mandate. "I don't want you to find what's wrong," he had told her on that first day, standing amidst towering shelves of dusty document boxes. "I want you to prove what's right. Assume nothing is real. Every asset, every contract, every rail spur and warehouse, it's a ghost on a map until you can stand on it, touch it, and verify its foundation with your own eyes. I need you to draw me a true map of my own company, Elara. Be the ghost in my machine." And she was. For 6 months, Ellie Vance became a phantom. She and her team lived in that subterranean office, fueled by bad coffee and a shared, obsessive purpose. They tore through Julian's meticulously falsified records, unraveling a decade-long web of deceit that went far beyond Terra Nova. They discovered ghost employees on the payrolls of distant subsidiaries, shell consulting firms billing for imaginary services, and inflated maintenance contracts that funneled millions into offshore accounts. It was a digital and financial archaeology, digging through layers of deception to find the bedrock of truth. Each discovery was not a victory, but another wound on the body of the company that had to be cleaned and sutured. It was slow, unglamorous, painstaking work. Arthur, meanwhile, was fighting on the surface. He met with bankers in New York, suppliers in Detroit, and union leaders in Gary. He didn't summon them to his throne room on the 50th floor. He went to them, stood on their factory floors, sat in their cramped offices, and drank their coffee. He was humble, brutally honest, and direct. He didn't just admit his failure of trust, he owned it. He laid out Ellie's preliminary findings, showing them not just the rot, but the methodical, painful process of carving it out. He was not asking for their faith. He was showing them the work and asking for their patience. He was rebuilding his empire one handshake, one honest conversation at a time. One crisp autumn afternoon, Arthur found Ellie not in her subterranean cave, but on the windswept observation deck of the Stirling Tower. She was staring down at the sprawling city, a tablet in her hand, displaying not a spreadsheet, but a complex, layered satellite map of the Chicago metropolitan area. "Finding any more swamps in the loop?" he asked, joining her at the railing. Ellie offered a small, tired smile. The months of relentless work had etched new lines around her eyes, but they were lines of focus, not fatigue. "No, just an inefficient rail spur on the south side. It's costing us $2 million a year in excess freight charges. Julian had it rerouted 6 years ago to service a warehouse owned by a shell corporation, which was, in turn, owned by his brother-in-law." "Of course he did," Arthur sighed, the casual corruption still managing to sting. He looked out at the city, his city, a place built of steel and stone and ambition. "The sentencing is next week. With the evidence your team uncovered, the prosecution is no longer offering a deal. They're asking for life." "Good," Ellie said simply. The word was not vengeful. It was a statement of order restored. "Phoenix Equity has been dissolved by federal regulators. The Cravath firm sent a 7-figure check to settle any potential claims and a multi-page letter of apology. We have new counsel." They stood in a comfortable silence, the roar of the city, a distant, muted symphony. "The board met yesterday," Arthur said finally, turning to face her. They have officially approved the creation of a new executive position. It's not a title that existed before. Chief Strategy and Risk Officer. It doesn't oversee a division. It oversees reality. It reports directly, and only to me. He paused. The board and I would be honored if you would accept it. Ellie looked at him, her expression unreadable. For months, she had been a tool, a necessary phantom to ensure the company's survival. This was different. This was a seat at the table. This was a voice. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. I'm not a C-suite executive, Arthur. I'm an analyst. I live in a basement with maps. You are the conscience of this company now, Elara, he said, his voice thick with a sincerity that was almost overwhelming. For 30 years, I've been surrounded by men who told me what I wanted to hear. They showed me beautiful pictures of the future. You showed me the truth of the present. You're not blinded by ambition or tradition. I don't just need that. Sterling Industries needs that. He gestured to the sprawling city below. My grandfather built this company on a simple idea. If you lay a solid foundation, the structure will stand for a century. Julian tried to build a skyscraper on a photograph of a swamp. You reminded me what a real foundation looks like. Ellie thought of the Starlight Diner, of the crushing, suffocating weight of her past failure, of the quiet desperation that had been the wallpaper of her life. She had come to Sterling Industries to find a fraud in a document. She had ended up finding the fault lines in an entire world, and in doing so had rediscovered her own solid ground. On one condition, she said, her voice steady. Anything. The company establishes and funds a permanent grant program, the Elara Vance Foundational Truth Grant. It's for students in public universities and community colleges, the ones who can't afford the Ivy League, studying geography, geology, GIS, and cartography. We find the kids who see the world differently, the ones who look at a map and see a story. We give them the tools they need, and we make sure they know that seeing what's really there is the most valuable skill in the world. A wide, genuine smile broke across Arthur Sterling's face, the first she had seen in all these months. It's done. Welcome aboard, Miss Vance. He offered his hand. She took it. Her palm was no longer soft. It was the firm, steady hand of a woman who knew her place in the world and knew that her place was to question the very ground everyone else stood upon. Later that week, long after the city's offices had gone dark, Ellie found herself parked across the street from the Starlight Diner. The neon sign flickered, casting a lonely, buzzing glow. The clock in the window was still stuck at 4:13, a moment frozen in time. On impulse, she got out and went inside, the bell over the door jingling with a sound that felt like it was from another lifetime. She sat in booth 4. The cracked red vinyl felt like a familiar scar. A young waitress, new and nervous, came to take her order. Just coffee, please, Ellie said with a soft smile. Black. As she sipped the notoriously bitter brew, she pulled out her new, company-issued tablet. On the screen was the satellite map of North America, overlaid with the thousands of assets, routes, and contracts that constituted Sterling Industries. It was no longer a ghost map. It was a living document. Areas she and her team had verified glowed a steady, solid green. The areas still under investigation pulsed a cautionary yellow. The parts tainted by Julian's fraud were cordoned off in red, like wounds being debrided. It was a mess. It was complicated. It was incomplete. But for the first time in 4 years, Elara Vance looked at a map and saw not the terrifying potential for a catastrophic failure, but the endless, challenging, and beautiful landscape of a future waiting to be built, one verified coordinate at a time. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this time the foundation was as solid as the bedrock of the continent itself.